Australia promises more aid for Ukraine as NATO kicks off. The new CEO of Star says it isn't about the casino anymore. And investors start getting interested in property companies again. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It is Thursday, the 11th of July, 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, the main story this morning, Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles is in Washington attending the NATO summit as the major Western powers really push to shore up support in the Indo-Pacific.
The Indo-Pacific has become a growing area of interest for NATO, and for the third year in a row, the leaders of New Zealand, Japan and South Korea have attended the meeting. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, of course, was invited. He declined the invite, sending Mr. Marles instead. Now, the Defence Minister yesterday tweeted that NATO is a force for peace, and he thanked Joe Biden for hosting the celebrations. During the NATO meetings, Assistant Defence Minister Matt Thistlethwaite told ABC Radio that Australia will extend its efforts to help Ukraine repel Russia. Now, Ukraine really is a key theme at the conference. The United States and its allies have agreed to provide additional air defences to the country following devastating missile attacks this week. Now, those Russian attacks killed at least 38 people across Ukraine and destroyed a Kiev Children's Hospital. US President Joe Biden unveiled plans to provide Ukraine with dozens of tactical air defense systems to protect Ukrainian cities, including Patriot batteries and components and other advanced defense systems. Mr. Biden said that Ukraine can and will stop Vladimir Putin. He said NATO is more powerful than ever and is the greatest military alliance in history, according to a report on Reuters. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg urged countries to back Kiev, saying the outcome of the war will shape global security for decades to come.
Sean, NATO is a significant focus on factors outside domestic politics in the US, and dare I say one that's probably needed, isn't it? Given the growing conviviality between Vladimir Putin and other non-NATO countries.
Yeah, so true. Last week, the Russian leader was meeting China's President Xi Jinping. This week, it's Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Mr. Modi flew to Moscow just as that Russian bombing in the Ukraine occurred. When the two met, they hugged. Mr. Putin called Mr. Modi my dearest friend. Of course, India is part of the Quad partnership with Australia. That's Japan and US is in that as well. Now, the Quad partnership's focus is on the Asia Pacific. But I got to say, watching Mr. Modi and Mr. Putin cozy up isn't that good a look for Quad members. It's a very weird world we live in, Michael.
Yes. Yeah. And you actually talked about this in yesterday's Fear and Greed newsletter, which is well worth a read if you have already subscribed and have it sitting there in your inbox. Check it out. If you haven't subscribed yet, jump onto fearandgreed.com.au, pop your email address in. It costs you absolutely nothing, and you'll get next week's edition next Wednesday morning. Sean, turning our attention back home now, how did local markets perform yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed down at 0.2% to 7,817 points. It fell on the opening, then scrambled higher for most of the day. The utilities and materials sectors were the worst on the day, while telcos was the best. Iron ore futures were lower, pulling down the big miners. BHP, Fortescue Metals and Rio Tinto all fell more than 1%. Telstra's share price continued its run of Tuesday, jumping 2.4% yesterday. It hit a 10-month high. The banks were mixed, while the big retailers were higher. Insignia Financial's share price fell 7% after it told investors that it hadn't asked for M&A help from investment group Citi, as had been written in the media. And Bell Financial share price jumped after it said it expects the first half pre-tax profit to rise by about 47%.
What about international markets?
A very big day. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell appeared before Congress, and the general takeout is that while the Fed doesn't quite have the information it needs to cut interest rates, it is looking very hard to find it. The quote that everyone seems to have focused on is, and I start the quote, "Elevated inflation is not the only risk we face. Reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment," end quote. That helped equity markets, with the S&P 500 again closing their new high. That's 6 days of record highs in a row. The tech-heavy Nasdaq also closed at a record high. The tech stocks rallied. Tesla was up nearly 4%, Nvidia 2.5%. Apple jumped only 0.4%, but that was enough to push it past the $3.5 trillion mark in value. pretty phenomenal.
That is extraordinary, and the speed at which it's gone from 3 trillion to 3.5 trillion. Doesn't feel like it'll be long before we're talking about a $4 trillion company here.
Yeah, I know. There's a bit of talk around at the moment about when do you stop buying US tech stocks, because they must have a ceiling at some point. But it's just you're sort of courageous to bet against them at the moment.
Indeed. Sorry, I interrupted you. Please go on.
No, that's right. Just quickly, in New Zealand, the central bank kept interest rates on hold, and in China, inflation rose by less than expected. Now, Chinese inflation is not a problem like it is in most developed markets. In fact, a little more inflation wouldn't be a bad thing in China. Anyway, that's not happening.
Now, Sean, after the show, you have an interview coming up, a very timely one, this one. You're speaking with Thomas Fikentia, Area Vice President for Australia New Zealand at CyberArk, which is a supporter of this podcast.
Yeah, it's all about cyber hacking and what's going on. We talk about criminal groups and state-backed agencies and how they're now attacking aggregators. So they used to go for the big companies and hope they ransom would be paid. Now they're looking kind of for the middlemen in organizations, because that way if you can hack into one of those aggregators or a middle player, then you have the potential to spread bugs far, far further than if you're just going for one company. So we talk about that, and then we talk about exactly what execs should be doing to prepare themselves for cyber criminals. It's a really interesting chat, and I've got to say, Thomas, very plain spoken, very able to put it in plain English for people like me to understand. So it's well worth a listen.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think the point where he made that this is not just an IT problem now, that this is a whole of organization problem. So anyone in business should be listening to this conversation today. It is well worth it. Stick around for that one. It's coming up after the show. We will be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, a second group of boat people in a week have been intercepted by Australian authorities, provided with modern boats, and turned back to Indonesia.
Australian authorities provided the 44 people on board with fuel and food, and they were instructed to steer the boats to Indonesia's southernmost island of Roti Nadao. The Roti Nadao police found 44 men, 36 Bangladeshi and 8 Rohingya, washed up in 2 different locations on Monday, according to a story in The Australian. The men said they were intercepted by Australian Border Force and were detained in their vessel for 18 days. They were then given the 2 boats, each carrying 22 people with food, water, life jackets, and just enough fuel to reach Roti. Last week, 28 foreign nationals and 2 Indonesian boat crews landed on a remote beach in the southern coast of West Java. They had also been given a new boat after their original vessel was seized and destroyed by the Australian Border Force. Roti Nadao police said the Malay-speaking immigrants learned about the possibility of going to Australia through Indonesia via TikTok.
Sean, Incitec Pivot says it has ceased negotiations with an Indonesian company for the sale of its fertilisers business.
The splitting of the fertiliser and explosives business has been mooted for months, maybe years. Yesterday, the company said the deal with the Indonesian group had fallen over. Basically, it just wasn't going forward fast enough. The explosives arm, Dyno Nobel, and the fertiliser division will now be managed separately. That means no shared costs, just run as very separate businesses. CEO Mauro Neves said the strategy hasn't changed, but the company will have to work harder to execute it. Basically, it wasn't just the pace of negotiations that Incitec Pivot was worried about. They're also concerned that even if the deal was done, it wouldn't actually receive Foreign Investment Review Board approval, so they pulled the pin. The company also said that it will start its $900 million stock buyback. It had put that on the table, but said it wouldn't do it until the deal was done. Now the deal's off, it's going to start buying back its shares.
All right. Now, I mentioned this one at the top of the show, Sean. New Star Entertainment Chief Executive Steve McCann says the company's casino business might never return to the glorious boom times it once enjoyed, and the future was likely to be in the gaming giant's restaurants and hotels.
In his first interview since taking the job, the former Lendlease chief executive told the Financial Review that Star needs to realise that gaming has changed and there's no easy transaction to sell the business or quick fix to turn around the casino group's fortunes. He said a reset is needed and management needs to rethink more about food, beverage and hotels and whether they should be considered as just feeding the casino business or more than that. Mr. McCann said the revenue base for gaming has been materially impacted and will take a long time to get back to anywhere near where it was, if it gets back at all. He said patience is needed to fix Star's culture, repair relations with regulators, and win back crucial gaming licences in New South Wales and Queensland, and he can't afford to be distracted by opportunistic tyre kickers wanting to pinch Star's casinos on the cheap. The interview, fascinating interview, read in the Fin Review if you really want to, it triggered a 3% jump in Star's share price, which, as it turns out, was the best of the ASX 200 yesterday.
Sean, an interesting question here. When is the right time to buy real estate stocks? It's been a question for the last year, but rising interest rates and low occupancy rates in office towers seem to have, pretty much culled most appetites for property. Now a few investors are just taking a look at REITs again.
Macquarie Group's investment team says it's time for investors to start thinking about real estate investment trusts and other companies that are less linked to the economy, particularly as they expect other parts of the share market to struggle. Macquarie's team, in a note, says, "We are now at the start of the slowdown phase where returns are usually positive but tend to be lower. REITs should benefit from lower interest rates, and with the US Fed set to cut later in the year alongside Macquarie's view that local rates won't rise again, it suggests property plays are becoming more attractive." Now, Macquarie already has Charter Hall and Goodman Group in its model portfolio. It's added Mirvac. Of course, we aren't an investment podcast. You need to go and find your own advice before making any of these investment decisions. But it's just interesting what the Macquarie Equities team is saying.
Finally, Sean, a bit of a run around the states. South Australia has become the first state to sign a federal government agreement to ensure every household in Adelaide can be powered by renewable energy by 2030.
The Renewable Energy Transformation Agreement is part of the federal government's plans to have an additional 32 gigawatts of renewable generation and storage built and operating by the end of the decade. Canberra will underwrite developers to build a minimum 1,000 megawatts of new wind and solar projects and 400 megawatts of new storage capacity. That would take the state's total storage capacity to about 600 megawatts. The state will establish its own grid reliability mechanism to be used in place of the national framework.
In New South Wales, the government has banned retailing on Anzac Day.
At the moment, retailing from 1 p.m. is allowed, but under new legislation, large retailers won't be able to open their doors at all. Western Australia is the only other state that closes retailers all day on April 25.
And yesterday, Sean, residents in Melbourne's West were told to stay indoors and motorists were told to drive with their windows up due to toxic smoke blowing through suburbs because of a large factory fire.
An apparent chemical explosion triggered the fire and about 180 firefighters were at the scene yesterday afternoon. Fire crews found multiple 44-gallon drums full of fuel at the site. Fortunately, there were no reports of injuries.
Turning to international news now, and Samsung Electronics' largest labour union of more than 30,000 workers yesterday declared an indefinite strike, which is a move that puts at risk production at the world's largest memory chip maker. That is a big strike.
That is quite the strike. The union's call for a general strike sharply escalates a dispute with South Korea's biggest company. Thousands of workers rallied earlier this week outside Samsung's chip-making complexes south of Seoul to kickstart what originally was a 3-day walkout demanding better pay. It's the largest organised labour action in the South Korean conglomerate's half-century history. The concern is that the action may snowball to hurt the country's recovering tech and chip industry. Now, this could have an impact in Australia. Remember the chip shortages during and after COVID meant it was very difficult to buy a new car. Well, this has echoes of the same thing.
Sean, vacuum cleaner manufacturer Dyson is axing about 1,000 jobs in the UK, more than a quarter of its workforce in the country, as part of its efforts to better compete with Asian players.
I love Dyson as a company. You know, they're innovative.
Mm-hmm.
Their vacuum cleaners work really well. I like that part of it. They've got a 15,000 strong global workforce, according to the Financial Times. Largest market is Asia, but it competes against local rivals in Asia that often produce similar looking products shortly after those manufactured by Dyson. Real problem for the company. Dyson, which is still overseen by founder Sir James Dyson, has grown beyond its initial specialism of vacuum cleaners into products including hairdryers, fans, air purifiers. Its engineers work on dozens of potential projects, many of which are never actually disclosed. In 2019, it actually abandoned a £2 billion push to break into the manufacture of electric vehicles, though it continues to work on batteries for its cordless products. However, the bottom line well, that's where it's struggling, hence these job cuts.
Sean, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview, and your guest today, as we mentioned earlier, is Thomas Fikentia, the Area Vice President for Australia New Zealand at CyberArk.
Yes, all about what's happening in the world of cybercrime and what business leaders should do about it.
Yeah, it's a great chat. It is up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And also keep an eye on the Fear and Greed playlist around midday today. We have another one of our bonus episodes coming up of Ask Fear and Greed. We've had some great questions coming in through the website, also through LinkedIn and Facebook and through Instagram. If there's anything that you want to know about the economy or business or anything that we talk about, really, shoot your question through. And Sean, we will do our best to answer it. And we've got a good one coming up today.
Yeah, all about Telstra pushing up its prices and whether or not it's a fair thing.
It is a cracker. It is coming up at midday, so just keep an eye on your playlist for that one. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Thursday, the 11th of July, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.